webinar launch of the study on addressing the gendered impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on economic, social, and cultural rights in Southern Africa, hosted by the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum. My name is Deseke Kasambala, and I'll be your moderator for this morning's program. We have a very packed program today. We are going to start the session with a series of opening and welcome remarks before we proceed into the findings of the study, findings and recommendations of the study by the author of the study, Kudakwashe Chitsike. We then have a really eminent panel of 4 discussants who will each be given 10 minutes to share their thoughts and to interrogate the study and findings before we open it up to the floor for questions and comments for 20 minutes. We will then end with the official launch of the policy brief. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Martin Masika, who is the Secretary General of the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum, for initial welcome remarks. Over to you, Martin.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and good morning to everyone. At the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum, we are delighted to have all of you this morning here to participate and share in the launch of the AJJF policy brief, focusing on addressing the gendered impact of COVID-19 on economic, social, and cultural rights in Southern Africa. So thank you for participating. That you have saved time to participate in this webinar says how important the subject of the webinar is to you, and so is it to us. For colleagues who might be meeting AJJF for the first time, we are a network of judges and lawyers across the African continent who work together to promote the rule of law in the context of Africa's development. We work in 4 main areas, which include access to justice, elections and the rule of law, economic transformation and the rule of law, and conflict resolution and the rule of law. Through a diverse range of actions, AJJF continues to promote state compliance with human rights standards in the context of national responses to COVID-19, hence this policy brief. The brief seeks to inform our governments, donor agencies, human rights activists, the academia, and all of its readers of the gender dimension of the impact of COVID-19, of the impact of the COVID-19 public health emergency on economic, social, and cultural rights in Southern Africa. It covers critical concerns regarding the right to work, the right to health, the right to adequate standard of living, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, the right to education, the right to take part in cultural life, the right to protection of the family and vulnerable groups, and the right to economic, social, and cultural development. It suggests policy options and makes recommendations. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves to be challenged, excited, and inspired. We are honored to have Kudakwashe, who authored the policy brief on behalf of AJJF. It would have been great to have Elizabeth Mangenje, who made comments to this draft brief, but has not managed to be here with us. We are happy, nevertheless, to have Lucinda van de Hever, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, who is representing the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. Very importantly, we have esteemed experts who will be making contributions to this topic. I thank each one of them for having accepted to support this launch by offering their expertise. Thank you, Nikiwe. Thank you, Mary. The other two, Selemani Kinyunyu and Agre, might not be with us. So finally, I would like to thank our moderator this morning, Tiseke Kasambala. She is the Chief of Party for the Advancing Rights in Southern Africa program at Freedom House. She's a human rights research and political analyst, of over 15 years of experience documenting and reporting on human rights issues in East and Southern Africa. Tiseke formerly worked as a deputy director and head of programs at OSISA, and before that, she was the director. She was the Southern Africa director at Human Rights Watch. And before I hand over to Tiseke, I would like to say once more on behalf of AJJF, you are all welcome, and it's wonderful to meet all of you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, for the welcome remarks. Before I hand over to you, Lucinda, allow me to give everyone a bit of a background in terms of your biography. Lucinda is the Women's Rights Program Manager at the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. For 7 months in 2020, she was a lecturer at the Africa Gender Institute at the University of Cape Town. Before this, she was a senior researcher and project manager at Accountability International, and she has also worked previously as the International Program Specialist for Sonke Gender Justice, as a field worker, senior field worker for the Triangle Project, and as the National Manager of HIV and AIDS Program at SCORE International. Over to you, Lucinda, for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiseke, and to Martin. It is very good to be here. So, good morning, esteemed colleagues, partners, comrades, and allies. Thank you so much to the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum for affording OSISA the opportunity to really share some opening remarks at this very important launch, in terms of addressing the gendered impacts of COVID. And when Nikiwe mentioned this to us, of course, I was very interested, and this is a really important topic, in the time of COVID. So, as has been said, my name is Lucinda van der Juffe, and I'm the Women's Rights Program Manager at OSISA. OSISA stands for the Open Society Initiative in Southern Africa, and it's a growing African institution which is committed to deepening democracy, protecting human rights, and enhancing good governance in the region. And our vision is really to defend an open society in Southern Africa by really looking at strengthening people's power and to ensure that, that we have inclusive, democratic, just and open societies, and that the basic human rights of all people, and I think particularly marginalized communities, are respected. And so our area of work is really, it cuts across 4 areas: democracy and governance, economic and social justice, women's rights, LGBTIQ, as well as, of course, human rights and the rule of law. And with the women's rights, we really focus on challenging the structural causes of women's marginalization, and really looking at building feminist movements, inclusive feminist movements, especially with young women, and really looking at issues of intersectionality, gender-based violence, and sexual and reproductive health and rights. So your report is really opportune. I would like to say congratulations. I had a look at it last night. It's really excellent and timely, and it really reflects a lot of the gendered nuances and the impact of COVID, I think, on women and girls and marginalized communities. So there's just a few, I thought that we'd share a few remarks on the report that we picked out. So we were really glad and delighted to see that the report actually looks across the gender spectrum and it considers the impacts of COVID, on a variety of women, especially women with disabilities, which is really important, as well as lesbian and trans women. We also noted other vulnerable groups, such as older women, may not have been covered, but the report, I think, really acknowledges the various intersectionalities that creates these vulnerabilities and inequalities. That has been further exacerbated by the state's response to the pandemic. And so we know that when COVID started, right, we all treated it as a health emergency. But I think as we engaged with grantees on the ground, engaging with institutions, we obviously quickly realized this is much more than a health issue. It's become a huge human rights issue. It's a political issue. It's a development issue, and this is very far-reaching impacts, I think, for communities. And COVID has really highlighted these inequalities that women face. And I think that the report provides such a more accurate picture of the actual progress that has also been made in terms of socio-economic development. So the report is really important for the following reasons. I think, it generates data and evidence from the ground, and this is critical because it allows us to obviously reflect on our lived realities, right, and the lived realities of people on the ground. And such reports really help us to take stock. It helps us to reflect on what we're doing, what we might have not been doing well, what we need to do differently. It shows where the gaps are, and it's really important for informing programming, policy, advocacy, and this is the kind of work that we do. And then the report really specifically points out some of the regressions that has taken place, I think, as a result of COVID, right? And really points out some recommendations so that we really, sticking to the mantra of leaving no one behind, so that we can truly make a difference in people's lives and we can see it in a more meaningful way. So I just want to hone in on two, in my conclusion, to hone in on two of your recommendations, which is really critical. And that's the right to work and the right to health. So with the right to work, this is a critical issue. Of course, we know under COVID, with all of the different waves, people sitting under lockdowns, restriction of movements, and it particularly has devastating consequences on women, right, on women with disabilities and lesbian and trans women, as you have noted in your report. It pushes women further into poverty and sometimes beyond the poverty line into extreme poverty. And so through working with grantees, the things that has come up within OSISA a lot, women and LGBTIQ people, they're asking for things like food security, food support. So that's quite clearly become a very tough issue. In the informal sector, we know that women have lost their small businesses. Some small businesses may not recover. Government relief is insufficient. So we really need to maintain pressure, I think, on government to provide this relief to families, including marginalized groups, and to really look at ramping up the vaccination program. I don't know how, we can't afford to have lockdowns for another year. And then the right to health, lastly, another critical area, especially for marginalized groups, as you pointed out in the report, for women with disabilities, for LGBTIQ, and especially having access to sexual and reproductive health. For transgender women, for transgender people, gender affirming healthcare is critical. And without this, it places a lot of strain and stress and risks the lives, I think, of LGBTIQ people, because being able to access hormone replacement therapies, I think, is really critical. And then lastly, sorry, which I must say, and I think in terms of the right to health, COVID has had a devastating impact, on all of us, right? It has shifted our relationships. People have lost their livelihoods. People are dying, falling ill. And so I think the issue of mental health is something which needs to be addressed very seriously, not only in the short term, but I think in the long term, because we're going to be seeing the long-term impact of this over the next few years. And I think that there's something also to be thought about and said about mental health issues. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. And again, congratulations on your report. And I really look forward to the rest of the conversation and hearing more from the other discussants. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lucinda, and thank you for really emphasizing the timeliness and the value of the report, and kind of the value that it brings to policy discussions within our region. And also thank you so much for setting out maybe other areas that the report may not have touched upon that are nonetheless important, such as mental health, and also how COVID-19 has impacted on the rights of elderly people. We are now going to go delve much deeper into the findings and recommendations of the report with the author of the report, Kudakwashe Chitsike. Kudakwashe is a Zimbabwean lawyer and women's rights activist. She is the author of the report. She holds a law degree from the University of Lesotho and a master's in public international law from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. Currently, she works as an independent consultant. She was previously senior program officer at HIVOS in Zimbabwe. And before this, she pioneered in collaboration with Witness, a project of documenting violence against women through video. Previously, she was the manager of the women's program at the Research and Advocacy Unit, RAU, an organization advocating for an end to organized violence and torture. Kuda has worked with groups of women activists and grassroots women on documenting violence against women. She has also worked, amongst others, with the Institute for Democracy in Africa and Transparency International Zimbabwe, fighting for the respect and recognition of human rights. Over to you, Kuda.
Thank you very much, Tseke, for that introduction. And thank you to AJJF. I'm going to not cover the full spectrum of the report. I will just pick certain issues so that we can discuss and encourage those who haven't read it to have a chance to go through it in full. So SADC members undertook several measures to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And these included preparedness, response mechanisms, awareness programs, suspension of business and tourism travel, set up border and in-country testing centers, social distancing, cancellation of gatherings, adoption of self-isolation in mandatory quarantine, and treatment for those that tested positive. Some of the member states declared states of emergency, such as Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo, Eswatini, Lesotho, Mozambique, and Namibia. And others imposed lockdown measures really early on, allowing only essential services to remain open. And these were South Africa, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. In 2020, SADC developed a 10-point coordinated regional action in response to COVID-19. I won't go through all of them, but some of them were risk disaster management. Member states agreed to establish national emergency operation centers to facilitate coordination of logistics and stockpiling for disasters at the national level, and to establish national emergency trust funds and national resource mobilization strategies to facilitate mobilization of resources for national disaster responses. They also reestablished and expanded the Technical Committee for Coordination and Monitoring the implementation of the SADC Protocol on Health, which meets regularly to advise the region on health and related matters and other socio-economic matters related to the pandemic. They also adopted guidelines on harmonization and facilitation of cross-border transport operations across the region during the pandemic. These guidelines were put in place to facilitate and ease the process of transporting essential goods and services within the region during the pandemic. They also partnered with the UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, to mitigate the effects of COVID on education. They also established a monitoring and analyzing the socio-economic impact of COVID-19 on SADC economies. So these guidelines, unfortunately, didn't take into account the gendered impact of the pandemic. So the focus of the report, as has already been said, is to look at how the pandemic affected the implementation of socio-economic rights, particularly on the intersectionality of women. The socio-economic rights focused on in the report included the right to work, right to adequate standard of living, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, right to health, right to education, right to take part in cultural life. I think for this presentation, as Lucinda has also just said, I will focus on two, the right to work and the right to health, because I think these are really important to talk about. So with regards to the right to work, COVID-19 control measures negatively impacted women, particularly young women and women with disabilities, who are the dominant labor force in the informal economy and in the service industries. Markets were closed and lockdowns resulted in job losses, as most of this is work that can't be done from home. In the SADC region, the risk of unemployment is compounded for women with disabilities who have less access to education and economic opportunities. Women therefore faced unequal access to social safety nets. While many big and medium businesses received COVID relief funding, some SADC governments did not provide similar financial safety nets to small enterprises in the informal sector, or where they were provided, the money was difficult to access. These businesses are the ones that are predominantly run by women. They're not registered, they're largely cash-based, and therefore they don't have the necessary certification, tax, or financial records to demonstrate the impact of COVID on their economic operations. The inability to work, coupled with little to no safety nets, not only robbed women of the ability to earn an independent source of income, but exacerbated financial stress, which when coupled with confinement to their homes during a time of hardship, increased the risk of gender-based violence. Many women were locked down with their abusers. The pressures and frustrations from job losses, as well as being in a confined space, resulted in increased rates of physical and psychological domestic violence. Women with disabilities were more likely to be affected by gender-based violence. And according to a UNESCO 2020 report, in Zimbabwe, 19.1% of women living with disability surveyed reported experiencing physical and sexual violence during the lockdown period, including abuse from a spouse over shortages of food and money in the household. Also, female essential service workers, including public health workers, suffered risk of gender-based violence due to the reduced availability of public transportation. There was a report of an essential worker in Mozambique that was raped while going home because she went home late and there wasn't much transport. Women and girls also experienced increased sexual violence and forced and early marriages. Again, in Mozambique, calls to the child helpline related to child marriages, abuse and neglect doubled from January to April 2020 compared to the same period in the previous year. Children with disabilities suffered a greater risk of sexual abuse. The pandemic restrictions increased care work as the responsibility of childcare falls primarily on women. With children out of school, many women had to stay home and tend to the children. A survey of young women living in urban areas across countries, including South Africa, found that 71% of respondents reported increased domestic work during the lockdowns. with 46% reporting an additional 2 to 4 hours of work, and 31% reported more than 4 hours of additional work. It's important to recognize the value of unpaid care work and domestic work, and to put in place public service and social protections for women that engage in this type of work. Even before COVID, women and girls with disabilities were burdened with unpaid domestic work, as they were most likely to have discontinued school at an early age. This obviously worsened with the pandemic. In response to the impact of COVID-19, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa urged governments to provide support to women who have lost their income. The Special Rapporteur also called upon governments to ensure their post-COVID economic plans included women in rebuilding efforts. So the recommendations for the right to work: SADC countries should implement fiscal and monetary measures to channel liquidity to small to medium enterprises, informed workers where the majority of women work, against the economic shocks of COVID. SADC governments should also provide adequate and appropriate financial cushioning to support those who were most affected by the lockdown, especially women engaged in informal enterprise. SADC governments should find economic and employment opportunities for women and other vulnerable groups to minimize job losses. One example is to provide work opportunity in the production of PPE for local use. And we'll move on to the right to health. The right to health includes access to timely and appropriate health care, to health-related education and information. This is including sexual and reproductive health. The protocol on health in the SADC region, the SADC Health Protocol, recognizes that a healthy population is a prerequisite for sustainable development and has various provisions that recognize the right to health for women, people living with disability, especially women and children, and among other vulnerable groups. Due to increased domestic violence and the lack of access to reproductive health services, women with disabilities, and LGBTQ persons suffered violations of the right to health during the pandemic. Basic health services were curtailed. Hospital resources and personnel were redirected to tackling the pandemic, impacting the quality and availability of sexual and reproductive services. The right to health for women includes the right to control one's health and one's body, including sexual and reproductive freedom. Regionally, however, COVID-19 measures led to a 68% disruption to family planning and contraception health services. The situation of access to contraception during the pandemic was likely to be more pronounced for women with disability due to historic exclusions. There was a decline in access to maternal health services, compelling women to resort to home deliveries. This is mostly because of restrictions on public transport due to the pandemic. Additionally, in some countries, they needed authorization or exemption letters to go through police roadblock, and this affected women's ability to travel. Those who didn't have letters or whose letters were deemed unsatisfactory were turned away and unable to reach hospitals. Female healthcare workers also suffered the brunt of COVID-19 infections. In the Seychelles, women accounted for 17% of health worker COVID-19 infections, while in Eswatini, females accounted for 64% of the population of healthcare workers who tested for COVID-19. The pandemic only served to deepen existing disparities in care for women with disability compared to women without disabilities. Pre-pandemic, the UN highlighted the intersection between gender and disability, stating, "The consequences of deficiencies and disablement are particularly serious for women. There are a great many countries where women are subject to social, cultural, and economic disadvantages, which then impede their access to health." The right to health includes access to information necessary to prevent diseases. Although SADC countries made efforts to widely disseminate information on COVID-19 to citizens, many people with disabilities were unable to access this information because by December 2020, prevention and safety information related to COVID-19 was not widely available in formats such as Braille, sign language, large text. Similarly, periodic COVID-19 updates provided by governments did not include Braille information, and there was no sign language interpretation to ensure the visual and hearing impaired people could also access this information. And due to social, political, and economic inequalities, women and girls with disabilities generally have low levels of education and are more likely to be illiterate, which limits their ability to access vital health information. In addition to inaccessible information formats, some health guidelines and attendant products for citizens to use in COVID-19 prevention were not designed in a manner that is inclusive of the circumstances of people living with disabilities. There was an example of a young woman in Zimbabwe who has albinism, and she couldn't use the alcohol-based sanitizer, and she was stopped from entering a shop, yet she had her own sanitizer. So these are just some of the examples. At the SADC level and within African human rights systems, there are no formal broad protections for sexual minorities. LGBTQI persons experience violations of their right to health due to lockdown measures. Restrictions on movement and social distancing measures designed to address the public health emergency. Members of the LGBTIQ community face difficulties or unable to make the necessary trips to access specialized health services. LGBTQ persons were often experience denial of care, misgendering, and trauma in mainstream public health centers, which forced them to rely on specialized healthcare centers to serve members of the community. And during the lockdowns, these centers were not open. The indefinite closure of international borders within the region denied trans individuals access to hormone replacement therapy for months at a time, leading to physical changes of their bodies, which in some cases led to depression and other mental health challenges. So the recommendations for the right to health, governments need to designate healthcare and related services relied on by sexual minorities and people with disability as essential services during responses to public health emergencies. SADC governments should comply with international guidelines on human rights-based quarantine and ensure where movements are restricted, provision for access to food, water, housing, and adequate healthcare is made available to citizens required to comply with stay-at-home orders. SADC governments should also ensure equal access to vital health information and provide public service announcements, such as on hygiene, physical distance, quarantine, and prevention. SADC governments should include representation of people with disabilities, LGBTQ persons, women, and indigenous groups in national and regional platforms responsible for formulating COVID-19 measures to ensure that their policies are inclusive. I think I will end there, and the other rights, as I said earlier, mentioned in the report, but I just thought that these two were the most important that needed highlighting in this launch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kudakwashe, and thank you for really comprehensively setting out your findings on those two particular rights. And as you said, there are other rights that are mentioned in the policy brief, and we may have some time to also interrogate those findings. To help us unpack this, we have two discussants this morning, and I'll start with Nikiwe Kaunda. Nikiwe is the team leader, Human Rights, Access to Justice and Rule of Law at the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. Before this, she worked as the Gender and Human Rights Program Manager at the Embassy of Ireland between 2017 and 2019. At Hope Age International, she supported the organization as the Regional Manager for Social Protection and Accountability Program. She also had a working stint as the Regional Advocacy Manager, Maternal and Child Health Campaign at World Vision. At Save the Children, she had worked as a Regional Program Officer for the Child Rights Governance Program between 2009 and 2012. And between 2007 and 2009, she served as the Assistant Program Manager at Africa Disability Alliance. She also worked at Women and Law in Southern Africa, Botswana, as a research associate. Nikiwe, welcome, and please go ahead with your 10 minutes of unpacking the report, the policy brief findings and recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiseke. I don't know if you can see me there. Okay, all right. Okay. Thank you very much. Good morning, colleagues. Good afternoon, depending on where you're at. I think, thank you very much, Kuda, for this, and AJJF for this comprehensive report. A lot of food for thought. 3 key issues that stood out for me in the report. The first, when we talk about economic participation, work and employment, it's true that we've witnessed an increase in pressures, especially for women undertaking unpaid care work. And it's not just older women, you know, grandmothers who traditionally stay at home, but also mothers who now, because children cannot go to school because of the extended shutdown periods at schools, have had to also step in and take care of children on a full-time basis. So the pressures and the burden of unpaid work has really increased for a lot of women. The other thing is that for those women who are employed in the formal workplace, I think that COVID has exacerbated the economic inequalities, and it has also reduced economic opportunities. This is especially true for women who are working in the retail, tourism, hospitality, and food services sectors. Most of the women who are employed have either lost their jobs or they're working at a fraction of the hours that they were working at. So the constant shutdowns, actually what they mean is that they either lose their income completely or their income is reduced. And what does this mean? Ultimately, it means that there's a widening gap between the earnings of women and of men. So we've made progress, you know, employing more women, but in some ways, COVID has also, and the constant shutdowns has actually made us take a few steps back. In terms of economic participation as well, the restrictions in movement and requirements for permits and curfews that have been instituted have meant that a lot of women in the informal trade sector also are unable to trade. Cross-border traders also are unable to operate. So it's really been a very, very difficult space for women in the SMME sector. The second area that stood out for me in the report, Guda, was around safety. The increases, we've seen increases in sexual and gender-based violence, SGBV. And I think that this speaks to actually the need for us to address this area, the structural causes, you know, so look at long-term interventions. That is what COVID has shown us, that we need to look at the long-term interventions. But it's still very difficult to understand why job losses and pressure should result in increased violence against the LGBTQI population, against women and girls, why they should continue bearing the brunt of physical and sexual abuse, particularly in the home, a place that is supposed to be safe. So it is very worrying that with the advent of COVID, we've actually seen a regression in social norms and social behavior, and that is resulting in these increased cases of violence and abuse. And finally, I think what this report is speaking to also is that vaccine nationalism is real. And the concept of, you know, not leaving anybody behind is a fallacy, because we're talking right now today, countries like Botswana, who are touted to be rich, well-performing economies, you know, then they cannot afford vaccines for relatively small population of under 2 million people. And they're talking about vaccinating their populations end of 2022. So what are the implications on healthcare and access to health services? What are the implications on well-being, mentally, psychologically? What are the implications on tourism, the economy, education, political participation? So I think this report has really highlighted for me glaring gaps in those three areas. So in terms of discussing some of the core issues, what are the key issues that I think the report has raised? For me, it's 7 key issues that I'll talk through quickly. The first one is that clearly we need to ramp up vaccine manufacturing and medical supplies. We cannot rely on the global value chain. In fact, as Africa, and with the introduction of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, this is an opportunity for us to be less dependent on the global supply chain. We should not be importing PPEs. We should not be importing gowns and gloves. These are things that we can manufacture locally. And the response times, the delayed response times in responding to COVID and distributing this material to citizens has actually shown us that we are failing our people and that things need to change. The second thing I think that the report is pointing us to is that we need to implement gender responsive budgeting. If we are going to make sure that people do not fall through the cracks, women, girls, children in general, the LGBTQI population, women with disabilities, older women, we need to make sure that our budgets are responsive. If we do not put money to action, nothing is going to happen. So it's time we start interrogating our budgets, including at a local level, seeing how much is going to healthcare, how much is going to education, but also looking at specific budget lines to make sure that what is included responds to the needs of women on the ground. The third thing we need to do also is that we need to make sure that our interventions reach out to older women, rural populations, indigenous populations, persons with disabilities, and also women in low-resourced urban areas, because there's a dearth of information. In our response, I can speak to what we were doing as OSISA. Some of the requests that we were receiving were really basic. There were requests for shelter, requests for masks, for soap, for food, from the urban, from populations in traditionally the urban poor settings, from rural settings. So we really need to, when we're responding and we're putting in place policy and programs, make sure that these population groups are also covered. The fourth thing I think that the report points out to is that we're not harnessing the power of the fourth industrial revolution. We need to make sure that technology is accessible to everybody. We need to make sure that we use technology platforms to disseminate information and to make services accessible. One of the things that we're battling with is that a lot of countries across the region are not keeping accurate statistics of their COVID numbers. Some countries, you go to their national health or office of the president web pages, there's no information. The last information that's been updated is from June 2020, a year ago. Nothing that is up to date. And yet there's been so much progress made in terms of the information that we have on how to treat, how to prevent COVID, And most importantly, there are lots of conspiracy theories around vaccination. So we really need to harness technology and utilize it to make sure that we put information out there and we equip people so that they can make informed decisions. The fifth thing that the report really raised for me was highlighting really how much we haven't progressed in terms of the social protection mechanisms in the SADC region. We know that historically we are a region with high rates of migrant labor. It's always been like that. And so the likelihood of having a large migrant population in any country is very high. And yet we've seen in the COVID response that some governments were actually not providing basic support to non-citizens. We're talking about food passes, we're talking about basic income grants, we're talking about cash transfers, even testing for COVID, until recently was not available to non-citizens. And this poses real questions around human rights issues and the state of development in the region. So how do we make sure that we harness this opportunity to improve social protection mechanisms and ensure equitable access, even cross-border services, because we know that migration for work mostly is what defines our region. The sixth thing for me that has stood out is that COVID has actually overshadowed other health issues. Sexual and reproductive health, maternal and child health services, water and sanitation, HIV, cancer, non-communicable diseases. A lot of resources have shifted to COVID, and these other health areas have been neglected. And yet these are services that are continually required, including by women. So coupled with poor health infrastructure, we're actually COVIDizing our health response and neglecting all other health issues. And yet we need to look at the long-term impact of what this means for our healthcare sector, and also just look at what it is that we need to do to make sure that a minimum healthcare package is available to our citizens across the region. And finally, I think what the report has pointed out also is that we keep talking about building back better. Yes, there's been a lot of destruction that has arisen as a result of closing borders, as a result of shutdowns and restrictions to trade. But what is it that we can do in order to build back better, to make sure that women are reintegrated into the economy, to make sure that we support women in their trade, in their small businesses? I think that one area that we really need to look at with alacrity and with speed is tax incentives to the SME sector, because we know that women are the mainstay of the economy. We know that women support more than 5 people, for instance, in their families. We also know that it's not just a matter of survival when they're generating this income, but that it's crucial for sustaining the local economy in the communities that they're in. So as we project the future and how we want to move forward, we should also look at providing tax incentives, particularly to economic sectors that are dominated by women. So thank you, Tseke. I think I will stop there in my response.
Thank you very much, Nikiwe. I think thank you for really eloquently setting out the long-term policy implications that COVID-19 has thrown up for a lot of our governments in the region, and also for making the case for inclusive economic models. I'm going to quickly now move to our second discussant, Mary Da Silva. Mary is a human rights defender and attorney of the High Court of Swaziland of 18 years, with litigation experience, having studied national and international law, with expert knowledge of international instruments, regional and sub-regional treaties, as well as knowledge of treaty bodies and mechanisms. Mary is an expert on SGBV and women and children's rights, as they have formed a core component of employment and advocacy initiatives. She has analyzed various pieces of legislation and participated in devising advocacy strategies. She is also known for her role as a coordinator of the Swaziland Democracy Campaign and a member of staff at the Africa program of the International Commission of Jurists. Mary, you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Tseke, and good morning to everyone. Thank you to AJJF for the engagement. Most of what I would have, hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. I find that in terms of things, NICUE has taken the biggest slice of the cake. But coming from the context of Swaziland, in terms of the recommendations that have been made in the report, regard to the right to work, Swaziland is a very it's classified as a middle income country, but in reality, it's a third world country with levels of unemployment, and most women finding themselves in the informal sector. 60% of the informal sector is made up of women, and within this sector as well, you find a congregation of the LGBTI community. The LGBTI community is so discriminated in the country that access to employment and other opportunities are closed off to them. So this is the sector where they find that they can put their skills to work. And I'm very happy to see that in this report, we not only look at women, because people make the mistake of looking at women when talking about gender. We're looking at people with disabilities, and we're also looking at LGBTI. And as the Gender and Social Inclusion Advisor of the Southern Africa Human Rights Defenders, I'm quite excited that finally we have a report that seems to be all inclusive when you talk about inclusion. And in terms of also the issues around cross-border trade, just as NICUE said, the informal sector, most of the women that are there are engaged in cross-border trade. Apart from the fact that the borders were closed, they were unable to engage in their businesses. But for those that were able to, within the restrictions, to continue, our government seemed not to be accommodating of the fact that the trade has dwindled in terms of the taxes and the levies that are expected of these women and expected of these minority groups. The taxes remained the same. There was no rebates, there was no relief, there was no assistance that was given to them. So they were expected to still continue with their trade within the restrictions as if everything was all normal. There was the discussion around women in the minimum wage jobs within the textile sector, within the hospitality, within the retail sector. We know that many businesses closed down or they minimized operations, and the women bared the brunt of this. Those socially excluded persons bared the brunt. LGBTI community bared the brunt. They were the first ones to be offloaded where there were retrenchments. They were the first ones to have pay cuts when there were any pay cuts that were put in, were there, and there was no social relief whatsoever to then accommodate that income gap that then arose from that situation. Well, and then the other issue that I found most important to highlight as well within our context in Swaziland is the fact that people with disabilities, in most SADC countries, there are social grants for people with disabilities and the elderly. In our country, we have those grants for people with disabilities and the elderly, but those grants are so insufficient within a normal context. And there's been an outcry for over the years for an increase of those grants. But with the COVID-19 and the decrease in income generation by the breadwinners in the country, even those social grants have not helped in any way. Rather, they have exposed people with disabilities and the elderly to elements that may have wanted to take advantage of them by the fact that there's something that they receive when the general majority of the unemployed section is not getting anything. So these people are falling now prey to predators, people that were taking advantage of these elderly and people with disabilities and accessing those grants in their stead. When you talk about health, it has been said that I like the fact that NICUE has brought it out very clearly. The other health issues have fallen to the sideline. We have COVIDized our health response. Sexual reproductive health has fallen to the side. we have an increase in Swaziland of pregnancies. And this is not just within those women who generally cannot access contraceptions. This is even within the populace that has easy access to family planning services. Married women, professional women that have easy access to health services, that can fund their own health services, but they have fallen pregnant simply because there was lack of flow of the necessary contraceptives to the country, because everything was now around COVID. If it is not COVID related, then it became less of a priority. And therefore, there are some women, of course, we know that doctors advised you may not fall pregnant. There's complications to your health, but they found themselves falling pregnant and having to deal with other expenses related to health that would have otherwise been avoided had these health issues been taken care of. We know that COVID thrives, people that die from COVID is because of comorbidities. And the people that have these comorbidities, people with diabetes, people with asthma, again, the lack of medication and the cut off of the flow of these essential medications for them resulted in so many people succumbing to COVID simply because there was the lack of the necessary medication, because everything was COVID, and other health issues were less of a priority. We talk about food security, within our context, there were relief grants of less than $50. And this was a once-off. It was not as if it would come every month. So you were looking at having a once-off $50 relief fund that was coming through regardless of the size of your family. And also criteria that was used was the big is not deserving grant, receiving the grant. So there was quite a lot of corruption around it, how people have taken advantage of the COVID situation to siphon resources and funds that are critical for the health services, that are critical for the social grants, that are critical for economic regeneration, and siphoning those funds and using them for their own benefits and worsening the situation within the country. And generally, within the context of most African countries, our health systems are just basically inadequate. They don't have the quality health services that we require as people. And therefore, this corruption has made things worse. Lack of medication, lack of personnel, lack of the necessary. I remember when we were talking about oxygen and ventilation machines and all those other things, we were shocked to find that in the country, the entire country of Swaziland, we only had, I think, 2 of those ventilation machines that were required to assist people. So these are some of the things that corruption then, worsened, because rather than focusing on a practical and realistic response, it then went to people's benefits. And one of the other issues is the fact that in terms of our COVID response, I think there was the lack of leadership to the response. The response was short-term. It was lockdowns, shut down, and people not allowed to move freely, and all those other things. In the long term, there was nothing that was placed to respond to this. As Nikki has rightly said, the issues of vaccines, these are issues that should have been discussed at the very inception, but rather now we are like chasing the tail. The West has taken all the vaccines, this and that has happened, we don't have access, we don't have this, and that shows a lack of leadership in terms of responding to the needs of the people. I will not go too much into gender responsive budgeting. Nigiwe has spoken about it. Generally, across the region, the very few countries that have gender responsive budgeting, generally, even within COVID, it has shown its face. Within the responses, there is no inclusion in the response mechanisms to have people represented in terms of what the basic needs or the services, respective services will be. Rather, it has always been a top-down situation where certain people sit at the table and make decisions, and therefore in terms of the budgeting as well, they will skew the budget in the direction that will benefit them and not the minorities. Another issue that I think perhaps I would have wanted to have seen more specifically is the issue around hygiene and sanitation. We have heard wash your hands, wear your masks, do this and do that. But generally across Africa, you know, we have this issue of lack of access to water. And potable water at that. So our governments, we feel, have not been responding to those needs as well. Water, make the water available so that people can be able to exercise the necessary hygiene and exercise the necessary sanitation to help with decreasing infections. And then as well as education on COVID, on what it is and what it entails. Rather, what we have seen is this flooding of information that says COVID, wash your hands, wear your mask, social distance, but people not understanding exactly what it is and how it is transmittable and what the infection rates are. It seems to be an issue of the cart before the horse. And it is only now that governments have been seen to be trying to educate people more, but this is within specific countries. It's not cut across the entire region. So I just wanted to highlight just one thing about gender affirming services. You know, most of our SADC countries, we really don't have those, and particularly within Swaziland, and I know within Lesotho they do, but it's very minimal, and accessing those services has been very, very difficult for the LGBTI community, particularly trans women who have, Nigiwe has also said, who have waited months and months. Others, to the extent that, you know, it has caused serious health problems for them, you know, the restrictions not only on travel have affected them, but even within the service system, the service delivery system, it has taken the backseat. It has never been a priority in the first place. And now it has actually worsened the situation where it is not discussed at all. So those are some of the things that I wanted to highlight, because, you know, oh, sorry, I forgot the name. The researcher and Nigiwe have covered most of the issues.
Yes.
Thank you, Tiseke.
Yes, thank you so much, Mary. Thank you so much for actually now taking us all the way down and giving us the country-specific example in terms of what's going on in Eswatini and the impact of the pandemic on various marginalized groups. So thank you very much for that. I'm quite aware that we do not have that much time. I would like to set aside 15 minutes for any questions or comments from the floor. The way this will work is you use the raise hand function if you have a comment or a question. Alternatively, you can also use the chat box. If you are going to comment or question, please state your name, and if you are affiliated to any institution, the institution that you're affiliated to, and please keep it brief, about 2 minutes, since we don't have that much time. Whilst everyone is thinking if they have any questions, oh, I already see one. Okay, Tafadzwa, please go ahead.
Before Tafadzwa comes in, may I please?
Yes, Martin.
Yeah, so one of the panelists has just joined us. I think Agri from OSISA. So could he be elevated to a panelist so that he can make his response to the report?
Okay, thanks, Martin. In the interest of time, Agri, I will give you 5 minutes. My apologies about that. Let me quickly introduce Agri Aluso. Agri is a social scientist with a passion for empowering communities. He has more than 15 years experience of work in policy advocacy and governance with a focus on health, rights, gender, human rights, and child rights. He is currently the Health and Rights Program Manager at the Open Society Initiative for Eastern Africa, where he oversees a number of portfolios, leading initiatives aimed at supporting marginalized groups to challenge the numerous structural challenges, including those emanating from repressive legal environments that undermine health outcomes of the marginalized population. Agri, you have 5 minutes to share your thoughts.
Thank you everyone, and apologies for coming in late. So coming in without the benefit of the background of what probably has been said, apologies in advance if I say something that was already mentioned. But just to lend my voice to this, to the subject matter of our today's webinar, I think it's very clear for those of us who are working in this region that the issues of marginalization have been magnified, in very many dimensions by this COVID pandemic. All the pre-existing marginalization trends are, being bubbling up to the surface, with lots of negative manifestations. And just in the context of gender, I came in from when the colleague from specific examples. I think those are very spot on. What we have seen, are very deep structural issues that have been affecting particularly women and other minority groups really coming into the surface, with the fact that the people who are at the front line in the health context where I work, the people who are in the front line of this response are women, mostly as health workers at the health facilities or community health volunteers. Majority of them are women. And the trend that we have seen is a pattern where women who are at the front are not the ones who are also in decision making. So decisions are being made in ways that are, not most of the time, not very gender responsive or gender sensitive. A lot of policies do not factor in the disproportionate challenges that women face. But then they're the ones who have to bear the brunt of these, gender blind policies that are being made, in very many spaces by different state organs that are managing this pandemic. We have seen also a number of challenges, that are now coming to the surface. That the response is heavily militarized. That's what is favored. I think we are behaving like what Abraham Maslow described, that if hammer is the only tool you have, you tend to see all problems as nails. So COVID is a public health challenge, and we have a very fragile health system, and we are not able to respond with the public health tools. So we are using military, and the military has uprooted everyone. The militarized top-down operations have uprooted particularly the African populations who are heavily dependent on daily wage gigs, women who have to sell, in markets. Uganda recently went through a protracted period of lockdown without adequate social protection, and most families who rely on, people who do daily gigs to earn something so that they can be fed. Many of them face the very existential challenge or issues of, you either observe the COVID, protocols, or you face starvation, and that's not a dignified place where somebody, needs to be. And majority of people who are affected are women who have to take care of their families and have younger children. So those are some of the kind of challenges that we have seen, and we've seen, of course. I had the colleague from South Africa talking about constrained access to sexual and reproductive health rights. We've heard of so many instances where police, stopped people, on the road carrying a woman who is in labor and detaining them, and the woman ends up dying. Like 5 cases were reported in Kenya, and Uganda has had several cases where the system is not supportive, and then all efforts are geared towards COVID response and the pre-existing conditions. We just concluded a research which has shown that quite a number of the pre-existing health issues have been pushed to the back burner, and women who are, particularly women and girls who have a lot of interaction with the health system for pursuing the health issues for children and for their own, have had to really bear the brunt of this, refocusing of our health energies towards COVID response. And I think also the economic fact that I talked about, the 60% of African population, more than 60 actually, are in the informal economy, and this is one sector that nobody is paying attention to. We give blanket, proclamations without due reference to people who need certain special supports to be able to manage the economic well-being. So it's projected that by the end of this year, significant population or significant segment of our population is going to slip into absolute poverty. We already have a very big overrepresentation in that category, and you can already see how our poverty levels are feminized, and you can already imagine how much that is going to affect disproportionately people of certain gender. Not to talk about the minority group, the LGBTI, the sex workers, who people think do not even deserve to be part of the social protection infrastructure that are being rolled out. Despite the corruption, a few people are benefiting, but these categories that I'm talking about are completely out. So thank you, Tiseke. It's good to see you after a long time.
Thank you very much, Agri, for also bringing in the East African perspective to this discussion. I'll continue where I left off with Tafadzwa, who had raised her hand. Tafadzwa, please go ahead, and I hope you'll be able to unmute Tafadzwa. Yeah.
Good morning, Tiseke. Good morning, everyone. Congratulations for launching this research. I'll just make 2 recommendations in terms of comments. I propose that in preparation for future pandemics, there's need for the women's rights organizations, the government, and the private sector, especially the mining companies, to collectively come together and fundraise in order to support the needs of women and other marginalized communities as well. This is due to the fact that most of the reports that we got from 2020 noted that women, even in the mining areas where natural resources are vast, they were not being supported by mining companies. So we need to have a mindset in terms of engaging the mining companies and bringing them on the table. And then secondly, there's also need for the central government to increase their budget support towards the public service, social welfare, the Ministry of Women Affairs, so that they can be able to adequately respond to the needs of the women and other marginalized communities, including the judiciary and the police, in order to respond to cases of gender-based violence. And then finally, Tiseke, I'm also hoping that as we move forward within the region, there's also need to really review the National Civil Protection Acts and laws, because most of them are not really responding to the needs of the marginalized communities, where you find that their structures are male-centered and they're militaristic as well. So I'm hoping that these will also be considered for future preparation as well. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Tafadzwa. I think we have time for a couple more comments from the floor, if any. I'm also looking at the chat box and seeing if there's any pertinent comments there. Yes, I think I saw one. I think that was from Justice. It says, congratulations on launching the report. Very relevant to the current discourse on building back better and leaving no one behind. We cannot achieve these without addressing the challenges that have been wrought on access to socioeconomic livelihoods by the pandemic. I had a quick question, and maybe Kuda could answer this. And it is about setting the themes that we have seen coming through these discussions are all really about, in many ways, overhauling our economic systems, our health systems, our education systems. And I'd really like to hear from Kuda what her thoughts are about the direction that governments could take beyond the very specific recommendations that you give in the policy brief in making tracks towards an inclusive economies and inclusive economic policies. Perhaps, Kuda, you can share your thoughts.
Thanks, Tiseke. I think for inclusive purposes, it's really important for SADC governments to include vulnerable groups, consultation with vulnerable groups to find out what are the real issues on the ground. Because as I found in doing the research for this report, that wasn't a big consideration when they came up with their various responses to COVID. So a lot of people have slipped through the cracks and have been left behind. So for me, I think that would be the biggest issue. Consultation, whether it's through civil society organizations or any other ways that government can engage with people on the ground to find out what exactly are the issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kuda. If there are no other comments or questions, I will then hand over to Arnold Sunga to officially launch the policy brief and to provide some remarks. Arnold, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tiseke. And just to thank Martin and his team at the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum, where I sit as a board member. And just to also thank Kuda Chitsike for what sounded like a very comprehensive research on an important area. I must say that the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum have launched a few reports in the past few weeks, which I find all to be highly informative in terms of the findings of fact, but also the policy propositions that they've made in order to try and improve the question of both dealing with COVID-19 as a disease, but also mitigating the impact of the subsequent fallout in a number of areas, violations of human rights, the disproportionate impact on the poor and marginalized and vulnerable in our societies, but also the absence of safety nets, social safety nets, the ill preparedness of our different countries in terms of public health infrastructure. The inability, as Nikki was said, to produce even very basic things like masks, gloves, things where we tend to wait for leadership to be coming from other continents, which really also shows, I think, the weaknesses in our governance infrastructure, but also generalizing poor leadership in various sectors, not just the politics. Because I think if the politicians were the only ones failing, we wouldn't be seeing a situation where we don't have a capacity to produce, small things like nappies, like masks, beds, etc., where everything that you need to be able to mitigate the impact of COVID on everyone can actually be locally produced. So I think that dependency syndrome that Africa seems to show of waiting for leadership from other regions and elsewhere, it really goes to attack the dignity and worth of African people, and I think we need to be able to resolve it. Suffice to say that I think one thing that is crossing my mind as I see the various researches and the policy documents that the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum is done. I've been thinking around the movement from producing these research evidence-based documents, knowledge tools, outputs, into how we can then practically move towards some form of implementation agenda, because I think what we then need is to be able to see how we move from acquiring this knowledge. We had a lot of suspicion that many things that Kuda discovered were the ones that were happening. But now that we have empirical studies and evidence, how do we then translate this knowledge into appropriate policies and into appropriate work plans that can then ensure that we contribute towards, improving situation as well as leaving no one behind, and even attainment of the, the sustainable development goals. So I think that's the big question that Martin and your team are all of you with, to say, let's balance between producing of evidence and knowledge outputs and the approach to different duty bearers in government, in politics, in civil society, so that we can do some form of implementation and ensure that we actually then use this knowledge to address the real problems that we have articulated so well. So with those remarks, I really want to then proceed, Madam Moderator, and thanks for your excellent moderation. I want to ask Mamo to do the ritual of launch, which I understand will be to share the publication on screen, and then I can just officially announce that it has been officially launched if it is presented as a shared document on our screen. So Mamu, do you mind sharing it on the screen? Yeah, if it's possible to share the book, not just your blank screen, Mamu.
Okay, I've shared it there.
Super. Okay, so I think with the sharing that Martin has done, may I therefore officially announce that this research and the policy brief is launched. Thank you very much. And I understand that everyone here is going to secure a copy through emails or also by visiting the website of the AJJF. And so with those remarks, Tiseke, I really propose to hand it back to you so that we can close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arnold, and thank you, AJJF, and thank you everyone for taking the time to participate. Thank you to the discussants and to Kuda for the very comprehensive and eloquent and rich discussions around the policy brief. I will now hand this back to Martin Masiga, and thank you.
Yeah, so just to thank everyone, the report is clear, rich from what we have heard and from the comments that were made by everyone. And as we have been challenged, the question is now, how do we go beyond making these recommendations and begin doing some kind of implementation and in terms of following up some of these policy recommendations that have been made. So that we are going to look at, and when we get to you for assistance, support, and participation at that stage, I hope like you came today, you will come again. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone. So we have come to the end.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Tiseke. Bye.
Bye to everybody. Bye.